Hello everyone, Reality Stop here, and I wanted to put together a quick little video on the different ways to extend Bolt. I've seen a lot of comments in Discord on custom units, and there's some people that come into Bolt thinking that custom units are the way that they should pursue extending Bolt. And custom units certainly can be extremely powerful and can do anything that the other types can do. They have some downsides, and most of the time you don't actually need to go all the way to a custom unit. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Bolt, perhaps coming in from Playmaker or one of the other visual scripting systems, you might hear custom units and think that's the only way available to you to extend Bolt, because that's how you would pursue that in one of those other visual scripting systems. But it's actually not. Inside of Bolt, there are super units, which might not be seen as a way to extend Bolt, but actually they can do a lot of the things that the other unit types can do. There's a few things they can't do, but they actually have some benefits over the second type, which is reflected units. That's where Bolt is actually accessing regular C# methods that are inside your code base and building nodes automatically for those routines. And then the last one, of course, is custom units. So I'm just going to show a quick graph that I made of all the different facets that I could come up with on the spot. And I'm not promising this is 100% accurate, but it's a table that shows the differences between the different types of nodes. Now, please understand this is only of the differences. This does not include all the things that they can all do, because there's no point in showing that in the graph. Of course, all of them can do values. Of course, all of them can have control flows. Of course, all of them can have, any number of inputs and that sort of thing. But there are differences between the different types of extensions. So over here on the left, we have the three different types of extensions that I mentioned. And then across the top is the different things that I could come up with that were different, but that at least had one no for one of those types of extensions. So before I dive into the deep end of this and what this means when you sit down to come up with something that you want to do in Bolt that's going to extend beyond the built-in units, let's dive in and look into what these look like when you use them in Bolt. I've come up with a completely contrived example that you've been looking at for the past few minutes. I'm sorry, bad professionalism there, but it's a completely contrived example that you would never do. All I'm doing is computing the difference between, or the distance between two vectors. Good old Pythagorean theorem, right? You just take the x-axis coordinates. I'm just doing vector 2 for simplicity. You take the x-axis coordinate, the difference in the x-axis and the difference in the y-axis. You square those values and sum them together. Take the square root, and you get your answer for the distance from one vector to the other. So if you were to do this in Bolt, I've done it inside a super unit here. Let's go ahead and make this big. You can see that it takes a lot of nodes to do. But it's relatively simple. You go through, you take your vectors, you get the x components, you subtract them, do just what I mentioned, and you get your answer out. And this works perfectly fine. It's just a simple mathematical equation. You can do this, of course, in a super unit. Again, this is a contrived example that all three different types can do. And you would never do this. There's a vector2.distance method that you can just call. But this is just showing the difference between something like this, which has a lot of nodes, and I should give it a name here, but will show up as a super unit in your macro, and it shows up in your fuzzy finder, and you can search for it, assuming it's a macro. I've done it as an embed, but so here we have a reflected node. This is a node that I wrote in C#, but I let Bolt figure out all the inputs and the outputs and the control flows and all of that for me, and I'm just calling it. Now again, there's some things that it can't do, but it makes it much easier to write something like a complex math statement. For instance, here you go. That's all it took. This is all I did to get this node in there. Now please don't use this as a guide for how you would necessarily go about implementing your own functions, especially when it comes time to custom units. This is just a quick and dirty. I'm not going to say why I did the things that I did, but this is what it would look like. Ultimately, I'm just doing this one line of code in this this method that's being called into. And you don't have to have the static. Please don't use this as a guide. I'll make a separate video on how to make these units. But you can see it's very simple, and it's doing the mathematical calculation that we laid out. And you could easily think of various other things that you could do in C# that would be very difficult to do in Bolt. Like, for instance, working with IEnumerables or calling into delegates or something like that that's a little bit more advanced C# than the individual little nodes that you get when you're working in Bolt. So this is easy, and if you're familiar with C#, you'd be very familiar writing this. And then I did this little include in settings, which means I don't even have to go into the Bolt types and include this different type. I just put this little attribute on this class, and it's automatically included. All I have to do is go into Bolt and build the unit options to get that node available. Then it shows up in my fuzzy finder, and I can put it in my graph just like this. And you can see it, yeah, it has the same nodes as the super unit, but of course, it's a reflected unit, and it might be doing something more advanced that would be really ugly to do, some really complex operation with branches and switch statements and all this that would be difficult to, or at least very large to write out in Bolt. Now, the last one is the custom unit, and that's really kind of the whole basis for this video, is when do you want to use a custom unit? What are the things that go into the calculation of why you would do that? And you say, reality, why are you discussing this? Because I put out a library of custom units, and I publish it to the community. And yet here I am saying you might not want to do that. And that really is true. I'm doing that because one of the strengths of custom units is the ability to do things like control whether there's a label on ports, control what it is, have an icon, and all these other little bits and bobs you can customize so that it matches Bolt's look and feel. And that's ultimately why I do that in the community add-on project. That's not to say that custom units have no other place. Now let's go and get into that detail. But you can see here, just the same, I was able to build this as a custom unit. But take a look at the code for a custom unit. It's a lot more. This is that unit that you just saw, the equivalent to this one line of code right here. Well, I guess it's a few more for the C# decorations. But this is the equivalent code in 1.4, Bolt 1.4, for how you would get that same behavior and that same structure that Bolt automatically figured out for the reflected unit. It automatically saw, okay, well, I have a float return value and vector inputs, and it's a function, so I need to control when I need to call into that function, so it has a control flow in and a control flow out, because it's calling the function or the method. And so, yeah, it takes all of this to describe that. You have to say what it is, you have to say what type it is, you have to specify how to extract it out, what the relations between various things are, and ultimately get the values out. And again, we just do that same mathematical calculation. Here's the core of it right here. But I had to do all of that overhead to get that one bit in there. And sometimes that's really not worth it. For some of the things that we're going to get into on this chart, it's just not worth it all the time to do that if you don't need it. So let's dive into this chart just a little bit more, and I'll talk about what considerations you might have when you sit down. And again, we'll have other videos on how to actually make each one of these types of units. Well, maybe not super units because you have the tutorial for that, but how to do reflected units, what the considerations are, what options are available to you, what you can do to kind of spiffy them up a little bit. And then we'll also have one on custom units. Now, custom units are a much more advanced topic, and unfortunately, we're still figuring Bolt 1.4 out. It just came out hours ago as of the making of this video, and we're still figuring it out. We're still figuring out and reverse engineering how to work with it, particularly with events. But we're getting there. So the first thing here is Live Edit, which is a new feature for Bolt 1.4. It's something that we didn't really have before, and it's a really compelling reason to use super units over the reflected units and the custom units, because of course during play mode you can go in there and make corrections to your logic and those persist. And that's something that you can kind of do when you're working with C#, because of course you can have the code up beside you and you can be working with it while the project is running. But of course you can't see the effects of those changes live as easily as you can with live editing and superunits. So that's a strong element to kind of favor just staying in Bolt and using superunits. But one of the cases where you might not be able to do that is if you have some of the advanced C# constructs that the compiler is doing some of the legwork for you. And these frequently will be some things that you wouldn't get into unless you are a C# programmer. But things like link, delegates, dynamics, reflection, threading, locking, networking, some of the advanced things that you just don't necessarily do in Bolt, you need to be calling into regular C# to be able to do those things. And so you can see that those you can only do with reflected units and custom units. But of course, reflected units can do that. You still don't need to go all the way to custom units unless you want to. However, reflected units have a downside, and that is they always take a control flow in. You have to have that because it's calling a method, because it's making a call, and it's not going to return until that call is done. It's a black box to Bolt. You can't have a reflected unit that does not have a control flow in and a control flow out. You have to have that. And that's actually going to place some restrictions on some of the places where you may want to use these. For instance, if you have an on-trigger event or something like that, and you want to have one of these nodes to resolve this reference here on the fly at runtime, you'll notice that there's no control flow here. And so you can't specify when this node should take place, if it was, of course, outputting a game object and all that. But so reflected units do have some limitations in that you have to be able to provide this control flow. And there's going to be certain situations where you don't actually have a control flow to be able to determine what you need to do. So that's this flowless unit. That's the best name I could come up with. You can, of course, do it in superunits. You can have just values in and values out. And you can, of course, do that with custom units as well. Keep in mind that all of the built-in units in Bolt, or at least most of them, are essentially custom units. Just that Laszlo and Ludic maintain those on your behalf. Likewise, you can't actually have multiple control flows in a reflected unit. If you want to have one of those, there's lots of inputs and you want to do some complex statements and things like that, you can't do that in a reflected node. A reflected node really is just a call in and a call out. Feed it some values in, get some values out, and you go from there. Now, you might be going, well, I can't have multiple values in a reflected unit and multiple values out. And that's not true. You actually can. Bolt will respect output parameters on the reflected units. So you can actually have multiple output values from a reflected unit, but you can't have, say, trigger two different flows depending on conditions inside the node. You can't do that. To be able to do that, you have to have a super unit or a custom unit. However, they do have some perks here, and that's moving on to these two right here. For one, super units and reflected units automatically upgrade with Bolt. That's one of the fundamental tenets that Ludic and Laszlo have to offer their users, that they can update to the latest version, and it's not going to break their game that they've been working on for a year, 2 years, whatever. They have to be able to offer their customers that. So they're going to make sure that any super units you have, any reflected units, are going to automatically upgrade, or at worst, they're going to describe what you have to do. In the case of 1.3, we had a fix button. And it really was just kind of you might want to do that. You don't have to, but you can. And it was very nice. Custom units don't do that. For the community add-on pack, it probably took me about 10 hours at least, and we're still testing, to go through and upgrade, maybe 30 nodes or so, just to do all the mechanical, well, for one, the reverse engineering, but the mechanical upgrades that had to go on, the learning that we had to do to learn and adapt to Bolt 1.4 meant, it took about 10 hours. And if I had done those as super units or reflected units, that number would have been 0. Because Bolt automatically upgrades with 1.4. And in fact, I've loaded this into working projects, And I literally upgraded to Bolt 1.4 for in zero amount, a time of 0 minutes. It was free. Custom units, not so much. And they're really, really fragile. Super units and reflected units, you're protected. Bolt will protect you from doing stupid things. Custom units don't do that. If you do something really stupid and you try to set up an infinite loop in a super unit, Bolt will stop you. It won't stop you in a reflected unit, but it will stop you in a super unit. And then if you do something like just rename a reflected unit, that's not a big deal. Let's go ahead and do it here. Bring this up and I'll go to this, and instead of compute distance, I want to compute distance 2 because it's for vector 2 as opposed to vector 3s. Let's rename this node and we'll go back into Bolt and we'll wait a few moments here while it rebuilds. And this is going to fail. It can't find the node anymore. But okay, well, it didn't find it anymore, but it tells me. It tells me that it couldn't find that unit. You can see here, and this is all from Bolt 1.3. We can go in here, and as long as I build my unit options so I get that new unit, anytime you're adding units or types, you need to go in and build the unit options. Once this is done, Bolt will be able to see that new function, and I can just rename it. Or I could do it in code. I can use an attribute and take care of that. Let's go ahead and do it from that angle. I can go in here and say, oops, I renamed this function. From compute distance. It's been renamed. So we'll go ahead and save that. We'll pop back over to Bolt. And boom, it's repaired my graph. Bolt protected me from doing something stupid. Custom units don't do that. You can see here I have this unit. If I go and I move, or there's any number of ways I can break this. I can move it to a different namespace. I can change the name of the class. I can change the name of one of the ports, and serialization will fail and it breaks Bolt bad. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to break Bolt. Okay, we're going to save that difference right there, and we'll see what happens with Bolt. It broke Bolt so bad, it threw me back to the setup wizard. I can't use Bolt on this graph at all. And if you look into here, you kind of have to try to find what even happened. You're looking through this, it's not obvious what happened. If I made a change, or I brought in a change that one of my other users made, so one of my other team members made, and I bring in the code change, and all of a sudden, it's blown up. I can't see my graph. I can't even go in and remove the node that's bad. It's just blown it up. And so now I know exactly what I did, so I can fix it. And I can still use that renamed from attribute on there, but Bolt itself doesn't protect me from that, and it certainly doesn't help you in trying to resolve it. Now, it looks like Bolt 1.4 is actually a little bit better. Bolt 1.3, you can use this at all. Bolt was entirely broken, and I'm not 100% sure that it would work properly going forward from here. But as you can see, this is a stop everything and go figure out what's wrong type situation, and we want to minimize those when we're working on these games. So that's something that custom units don't do, and they're going to break when upgrades happen, and it's just tough to deal with, and it's hard to justify all that extra overhead that you saw in that file for everything that you might want to do. So there's definitely going to be situations where it's much better to stick with the other two types, super units and reflected units. In fact, in my day-to-day development, I pretty much stay away from custom events, or custom units. The only reason I do the custom units for the add-on pack is because I want them to have that native Bolt look and feel with icons and pickers and customizing the appearance that offers. But in my day-to-day development, I don't use them. I don't find myself needing what they offer really all that much. I put helpers, I put my data classes, I put link statements, and various things like that, I do put those in reflected units because it's either easier or that's the only way I can access some of those advanced C# compiler tricks and things like that I want. But other than that, I find myself largely staying in super units because you notice super units can do almost everything that reflected units can do, and certainly everything except for these topics that are really going to lead you into the custom units. So where that starts breaking down, where you might find yourself really looking at custom units are really your only option, are when you're looking to do one of these three yellow things, or if you're being forced into using advanced C# things and you need access to one of these other things that reflected units can't do. If you need that, then the only option really is the custom units. If you need this advanced C# column and you also need one of these other things that are no, then custom units, all right, you have to do it. And this optional values is one I suspect I may just be not doing something right, or there may be some technical reason that I'm not understanding why optional values aren't supported. In C#, if you're not familiar with it, you can specify in code that something should be optional. So I could say, vector B, we don't really need that. That could be, well, if it was a float. So if we had like a float here or something like that, I could specify it like this, and then a function that's calling into this wouldn't need to specify B. B is optional, otherwise it has a default value. And of course you can do that in a, oops, a little bit too far there. You can do that in a super unit, but for some reason you can't do it in C#, in the reflected unit. There's no way that I know of to say, this port is okay if the user doesn't wire it up. If you go ahead and provide a default value, Bolt will still yell at you. It will complain and say that it's not available. And now, unfortunately, I have to, Vector 2.0 doesn't satisfy that, so I can't show it here really easily, very quickly. But that's just one of those random oddities that might force you into a custom unit, or say, oh, okay, it's worth it in this case to go ahead and pay the cost of not having auto upgrades, not having the error handling, and tons of extra lines of code of overhead for every single one of these nodes. But it does offer you the ability to customize the editor appearance. In a recent version of the add-on pack, we have new nodes that mimic some of the behaviors that Bolt has, where you can specify the number of arguments. Or maybe there's something that you want that offers a checkbox over here in the graph inspector, such as, I think equals does? Yeah. And you can just check a box and the node transforms. Things like that. Or perhaps you want to customize it in some way by, under certain situations, you want certain ports to be available, or you want this to look different, to have different icons. You want to have this kind of two-line naming scheme. This one doesn't do it, but some of them do, where they'll have two lines. And things like that, where you want to customize the way these look and feel and how they come across to the user. In which case, yep, custom units are your only option. You've got to go all the way there because you can specify at a much richer level how it should look, how things should act, and how the user can interact with them. Likewise, that's kind of the same as this kind of native Bolt and feel, but also if you want custom events. Custom events, not in terms of, if I right-click on here and say custom event, like you're normally familiar with in Bolt, but if you want to make new events, say you're a third-party package developer and you have your own Unity asset store asset and you want to make Bolt nodes for it, and you want to have an event when, say, a network packet comes in or the user does some special action, and you want to be able to have the user have an event on their object, and it handles it, and it's all very fluid. It has typed arguments and things like that. If you want to do that, you have to go the custom unit route. We're still figuring it out for Bolt 1.4. It's gotten significantly more complicated, in my opinion, than it was in Bolt 1.3. So I don't have one here to show you, but You have to. Otherwise, the only other scheme that you have is what I would refer to as manual events, which are what you're familiar with when I say custom event, these. But part of the problem with these is, well, for one, you've got to remember some magic string, and you just have untyped arguments. Whereas with a typed or a custom event from code, a custom event unit, you can ditch this string here, you can have typed arguments here, you can have options, checkboxes, all sorts of things that mean that it's much easier for the user to work with as your project starts to scale up and get larger and larger and larger. So when I sit down to write something that I want to encapsulate some behavior or I want to encapsulate some code, this is what's running through my mind when I sit down to write it. And custom units aren't the be-all, end-all destination that do everything and don't have any downsides. They do. They have some pretty strong downsides. It's complex to make these units. It's a lot of extra code. It pulls you out of developing your game. You can't edit it live. It's not going to upgrade with Bolt. It's not going to protect you from, oh, I moved it in my project and changed the namespace and now, 3/4 of my graphs are broken. It's not going to protect you from that. They have their place. They do. Looking like and working like native units inside Bolt, they excel at that. But that comes with a cost. Outside of that, I find in my day-to-day development that reflected units and super units encapsulate what I need to do so much better, and they upgrade for free. In particular, super units got a huge boost in Bolt 1.4 with the ability to do live editing. It's great. I've played around with it some. I haven't gotten a ton of experience with it, but really excited in the direction that that's going. That's something that's always a little bit of stumbling block for new users coming in. They'll see the problem, they'll make the change to account for it, and then they stop playing and it's gone. And now that sticks. That's preserved. So I'm not going to say whether to use super units or reflected units on a case-by-case basis. Obviously, that's up to you, particularly if you need the advanced C#. But there's going to be situations where you might need that, and it's a very nice tool to have when you need it. Otherwise, or maybe it's something that's just easier to write in C#. Maybe it's like our super unit here. Maybe you have some complex operation that's very large, a ton of nodes to do, it's got lots of branching, it's got lots of calls, you're accessing data classes or some third-party library, and you wind up with one of the spaghetti graphs with lines going everywhere, and it's just complex. Or maybe you're converting some code and you want to bring some of it into Bolt, but you want to leave some of that behind. I do that myself. I'll have helpers and things in C# that I call into from Bolt. And for those, it's just natural. It's some things translate to code so eloquently, like a mathematical statement. Once it's done, it's done. You can even unit test it in C#. Prove it's done, you never look at it again, you just keep accessing it from Bolt. And that's a great use for a reflected node. All of those are. But, of course, there's going to be things that they can't do. So, I know this isn't a layout of rules. If you're trying to do X, Y, and Z, use super units. If you're using, A, B, and C, use reflected units. But hopefully, I'll have a description in the description down below. I'll have a link to the forum topic where this table will be maintained, hopefully going forward. Or if you find something that I haven't accounted for, please let me know, and I'll update it outside of the video, of course. But I'll update it in the topic, and we'll have the latest version of this table there that you can access. And you'll get a good feel for it. As you work with these different node types, you'll get a good feel for when you want to use which ones. And for the bulk of the users out there, you're not actually going to need custom units at all as you go forward. Hope this was helpful. I know it's a lot of information. I apologize for that. I've been putting this off for a couple of weeks because I've just been trying to sort it out in my mind, how to present this information, how to try to compress all that together, and hopefully in a future video I will go into the details on how to make reflected units and custom units. Do what you want to do, how to make them look like you want them to look, and that sort of thing. But with the drop of version 1.4 that just happened, in particular custom units, we're still figuring it out, and hopefully we'll have that ready to go here in a few weeks. So Thank you very much for watching. Hope to see you soon. I'll see you next time.